Hello, everyone. Many new names and faces. What a pleasure. I'm Paul Pangaro, for those of you who don't know me. I'm current president of the American Society for Cybernetics. And even though it says American, we feel that we are a society for cybernetics and therefore representative of a world of international people interested in cybernetics. I'm here just to say hello and welcome you, to suggest that if you are not currently aware of what we do or not currently a member, that you visit our website. There are many, many resources there. It's where we announce upcoming speakers. There's also a mailing list. And if you wish to become a member, please get in touch with me. I'll give you my email address in a moment, or anyone else associated. If you have questions about the society, we'd love to have you join, but even questions are welcome. And with that, I will thank Howard for making the arrangement today to take over.
Thanks, Paul. Well, recently we've been talking at American Society for Cybernetics, ASC, about framing these monthly talks around fresh eyes and new voices, people who are maybe new to ASC, but finding in cybernetics new wellsprings of rigor and creativity. And under that rubric, I've been in contact with Rodrigo Nunes and been very enthusiastic about Rodrigo's book, Neither Vertical nor Horizontal, and I'm delighted to have Rodrigo join us here today. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. If you are an ASC member and are interested in hosting one of these sessions, as I'm doing today, welcome to get in touch with me. I'd love to talk with you about that. Another announcement, Rodrigo is going to talk for a little bit about this topic of neither vertical nor horizontal. I ask everyone to hold off with your comments throughout Rodrigo's talk, and then after the talk, I'll start with some conversation and questions of Rodrigo, and then gradually we'll open it up and invite everyone to join us. Without any further announcements, please, Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you very much, Paul and Mateus, for putting this together and making this talk happen. And particularly, thank you very much to Howard, not only for his invitation, but above all for his persistence, because I think the best part of a year trying to schedule this talk. And uh, 2024 was a very chaotic year for me because it was my first year teaching. Well, not quite, but for all practical purposes, my first year teaching in the UK. Also, a very difficult year at a personal level. Um, and in the end, as I was joking before we began, we spent a year trying to schedule this, and probably in the end, we found the worst possible date for me because I just moved house a week ago, and term began. So it was a super. Um, it wasn't well to um, say to understate it. It wasn't the best time. And at various points in while we were trying to make this happen, we talked about different things that I would have wanted to discuss. At some point, I remember I talked about presenting on Alexander Bogdanov, the Bolshevik forerunner of cybernetics and systems theory. But then I said, oh, I don't think I will have the time to finish the text by then. And that was so long ago that the text is now finished, but it didn't even occur to propose that again. But anyway, at some point, Howard convinced me that I could just talk about this book, Neither Vertical nor Horizontal, that came out a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now. And the ways in which it intersects with cybernetics and the ways in which I found inspiration from cybernetics in writing it. So this is what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully the book is still, even though it's been out for a few years now, it will still be new to most of you, and hopefully this will at least serve to intrigue you a little bit and make you seek the book afterwards. So why cybernetics for a project on political organization, which was something that I was working on for the best part of a decade, I'd say, and that finally came to a conclusion, or well, not a conclusion, but came to a bigger lengthier statement in this book, neither vertical nor horizontal. Apart from a long-standing personal interest that I had in cybernetics as one of my several side projects or side interests, I thought cybernetics was useful in order to, and in fact necessary, in order to counteract a certain implicit prejudice in discourses on political organization, or in the discourses on political organization that you'd find in politics or in political theory. That prejudice being that political organization is something that is rare in that it is conscious. It amounts to a decision taken by certain people, a deliberate decision taken by certain people to organize politically, and also it amounts to a choice to organize in a specific way, so to a choice for a specific organizational form. And that, as such, a number of corollaries that we can draw from this prejudice, that there is a sharp division between what is organized and what is not organized, and between social or economic organization and political organization proper. So I wanted to question this, all the all the different elements that I've just listed of this prejudice, and that was one of the reasons why cybernetics became useful for me. So against this prejudice, I wanted to argue that there is a much greater much greater continuity between social and political organization than is usually allowed for, in that social forms of social. So you can think, I'm thinking here particularly of the Marxist, and particularly the Marxist-Leninist tradition, for which political organization proper only begins the moment workers realize that their struggle is a struggle for political power and organize in a party to fight for political power. Against that, I wanted to argue that actually people organize politically in ways that often simply follow the path of least resistance for them, and therefore is continuous with ways in which they are already socially organized. I wanted to organize that there is, I wanted to argue that there is organization even where there is no deliberate choice of form, in the sense that patterns of organization emerge all the time through through interactions among people. The emergence of constraints in cooperation and the patterns formed by these constraints being what organization effectively is at its most basic level. And I wanted to argue that there is no such sharp division between the organized and the unorganized, um, or in fact, more than that, that there is no such thing as the unorganized. Whatever exists is maintained in its existence by the reproduction of certain constraints or patterns of constraints. Those patterns, those constraints and those patterns might change, but the fact that constraints and patterns of constraints exist is intrinsic to the existence of a thing. To that extent, that thing can be said to be organized, and therefore, a thing that is not organized is an empty concept. There is no such thing as a thing that is not a thing that is not organized is not a thing. It's nothing. Which I would realize this was actually the starting point already for the first book that came out of this project on political organization right at the start of it in 2014. This is a book, this is a short book called Organization of the Organizationless, Collective Action After Networks, which was written very much in the heat of the 2013 protests in Brazil, but that entire wave of protests of the beginning of the last decade, the Arab Spring, the Indignados in Spain, Occupy, etc. So this idea that there is no such thing as that everything is organized in its own way was already the starting point for that book, Organization of the Organizationless, prior to my encounter with the work of Alexander Bogdanov. And it was only maybe a couple of years later, after Organization of the Organizationless, when I started reading Bogdanov, that I would realize that this is precisely what Bogdanov called the organizational point of view, which he said was the only monistic understanding of the universe, i.e. the perspective from which organization and its mechanisms appears as the most universal reality. So this latter point, that there is that everything that is organized, entails, and that or rather this what Bogdanov calls the organizational point of view, which followed from this path that I was searching for back in 2014, entails a continuity between conscious, deliberate political organization and self-organization understood as the emergence of constraints and patterns in the physical, chemical, and biological worlds. So consequence of the organizational point of view is that everything is organized from the inorganic to living matter, which is tantamount to saying that everything organizes, i.e. every event that occurs can be thought as an act that produces organization. And finally, that everything organizes itself, or in other words, that the universe as a whole is a self-organized phenomenon that consists of the constant organization, disorganization, and reorganization of its parts. So as a consequence, all the discourses, philosophical or scientific, that were monistic in this sense, described by Bogdanov, i.e. all the discourses that placed human organization, deliberate or not, as a reality that was not reducible to, but was at the same time conditioned and constrained by dynamics that were the same as those found in the organization of the natural world. Any discourse that was monistic in that sense was of interest to me to think about political organization, because precisely I wanted to think political organization as not a realm, a kingdom within a kingdom, as Spinoza would say, but as something that existed within the space, defined and conditioned and constrained by these dynamics that can also be found in the physical, chemical, and biological realms. Hence why cybernetics became of use to me in this project, alongside the universal organizational science or techtology of Bogdanov, but also the philosophies of Spinoza and Simondon, information theory, the thermodynamics of dissipative structures of Ilya Prigogine, and so on and so forth. All of those things suddenly became part of thinking political organization, because I wanted to think political organization within that continuum. At the same time, my project was also intended as a corrective to previous attempts at incorporating self-organization into political discourse, which as I saw them, were marred by, first of all, a confusion between self-organization, or tendency to confuse self-organization and self-management, i.e. workers or people's direct control over their productive and or political activity. This confusion to think that self-organization and self-management were, this confusion that consists in thinking that self-organization and self-management were the same thing, led to the false conclusion that social self-organization could only be instantiated by specific social forms, by self-management in the strict sense, or that these and these alone, so those social forms that we could describe as self-management, would necessarily display the characteristics ascribed by science to self-organized natural phenomena. Interestingly, we can see how this confusion is actually produced by that very prejudice that I was mentioning at the start. The idea here is self-organization would only apply in the human world wherever there was a conscious decision for a certain form to apply or to adopt a certain social form that would be describable as self-organized. So this was the first problem that I was trying to get away from in attempts to bring scientific discourses on self-organization into political thought. The second problem was the tendency to use self-organization as a way to evade questions of collective political agency at scale. I discuss in the more historical part of the book, I discuss how the incorporation of these discourses on self-organization takes place in political discourse from the more intensively from the 90s onwards, precisely at a moment when not only political agency at scale, so the big social democratic or the big workers' parties across the world, the big trade unions, but also the very idea of collective agency or collective action at scale, with the crisis and final demise of the Soviet bloc. All of this was in crisis, and self-organization is incorporated at that moment as a way of trying to get away from questions of collective political agency, rather than thinking them anew, or thinking them within a different framework and in a different context. So the idea, what was attractive, obviously, at that point was in the discourses on self-organization that could be found in complexity theory, in chaos theory, in the work of Ilya Prigogine, etc., was the idea of large effects from small causes. But the problem was, first of all, that this attempt to bring into politics this idea of large effects from small causes paid, for the reasons I would claim, for the reasons that I've just discussed, very little attention to the conditions that made the passage from small causes to large effects possible. I.e., for example, if we're thinking about the work of Ilya Prigogine, that for small fluctuations to produce large-scale transformations, the system must A, be far from equilibrium, which is not a condition that's met all the time, and B, those fluctuations must attain what Prigogine calls a critical size, so that they can beat the system's tendency to inhibit the spread of those fluctuations. So this this led to this let's say truncated incorporation led a lot of these attempts to incorporate self-organization into political thought to project their own values onto self-organization. So to think that the telos of self-organization would be not only finding a viable configuration of the system, of a system among others, but also one that corresponded to some ideal of justice held by the observer, so that there would be something good or fair or just, etc., about self-organization per se. And therefore, a tendency to interpret self-organization teleologically. So as spontaneous underlying order to be protected from what perverts its natural tendency towards viability, fairness, efficiency, robustness, all the values that were ascribed to it, or as an imminently unfolding evolutionary tendency. In other words, what this attempt did was to overcompensate the previous tendency that could be found in the Leninist tradition of positing a transcendence of the actors over the process, to ascribe demiurgic powers to the revolutionary subject, with a tendency to to overcompensate that with a transcendence of the process over the actors. So the self-organization was treated as something else, something other than what actors did, which is why things that actors did could actually, instead of being part of what self-organization was, they could prevent self-organization from happening. So the problem there was that people transformed the true idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and that ultimately no one can control all the effects of their actions, into the false conclusion that, left to their own devices, things would just happen, and that trying to influence their course could only prevent them from happening as we believed they should. So against this tendency to talk of self-organization as seen as seen from above, as I call it in the book, as a logic that was transcendent to the actions of actors and that could be objectively grasped by an observer existing within it, which is any observer within, speaking from within society. Another goal of this project was to present or to think about self-organization as seen from the inside. That's how I described one of the principles of the book right at the start. What I mean by that is self-organization is seen from the inside, that is, by agents with limited information and capacity to act, for whom the future is unknown and open, and who wish to increase the probability of certain outcomes over others without ever having absolutely certain knowledge of what might be the best way to do so. Here I've found not so much inspiration, but a very interesting convergence between cybernetics and debates on organization, specifically, though not only in the Marxist tradition, because what I realized was that what I was calling self-organization as seen from the inside, not only repeated, but revealed the identity of two gestures that had two previous theoretical gestures. One, which was the gesture that second-order cybernetics had made in relation to first-order cybernetics. The other, the gesture that Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg had made in relation to the orthodoxy of Second International, i.e. the most historically deterministic form of Marxism. That gesture consisted in resituating the observer in the world regarding which an observation is made, exposing the falsehood of assuming a contemplative stance. If we are not outside the world that we describe, but inside or alongside it, not only are the description we make themselves actions within that world, but our actions in general have effects on what is described. In second-order cybernetics, this amounted to making the observer who describes the system into the object of a description by another observer, thus showing that all descriptions are partial perspectives within a shared world. In Lenin and Luxemburg, it entailed arguing that dialectically understood, historical materialism was not a scientific prognosis of how history would pan out independently of what anyone did, but an instrument to guide the actions of those who made history happen, i.e. history still had to be made. And in my case, it meant asserting that since self-organization is nothing other but the emergent outcome of what we and our environment do, it makes no sense to restrict our sphere of action a priori in name of a spontaneous process of whose outcome we cannot be sure. And this was, finally, to come back to the more general question that I haven't addressed of why talk about political organization. This was precisely why the question of organization mattered, as it concerned the problem of assembling, expanding, coordinating, and deploying the collective capacity or a collective capacity to act. Now, the practical upshot of taking this position, what I'm calling self-organization is seen from the inside, was what I called a politics with the subject in. The realization that it is precisely because we are implicated in the processes that in processes that envelop and exceed us, that we must implicate our own subjective position and activity into every objective analysis of things. Which means turning every non-committal question regarding what should happen into a question about what can be done now from our partial perspective with the limited resources we have at hand in order to bring ourselves closer to it. Or, in other words, this would amount to feeding Lenin, if we take Lenin as a shorthand for the responsibility for producing effects, for the responsibility for producing our desired effects in the world, feeding Lenin through second order cybernetics, namely, or what if we take second order cybernetics as a shorthand for consciousness of one's own partiality. The point then was to show that self-organization, instead of being incompatible, as often thought, in fact entailed a politics built on subjective initiative and organization. And in order to do that, it was necessary to contest the grammar that is implied in the ways that people usually talk about organization. A grammar that supposes an opposition between organization and spontaneity, and between organization and self-organization. And this is possibly where cybernetics was most useful to me, by helping make explicit and helping problematize the topological assumptions that are baked in that grammar, in which the spontaneous and the self-organized is supposed to be what develops organically from itself without hierarchy or manipulation, and truly expresses people's interests and desires, whereas to organize, on the other hand, is supposed to mean, or is supposed to be, or is supposed to mean introducing something from outside, and thus also placing oneself above what is organized. This way, this grammar through which people usually, or that is implied in the usual in usual discussions of organization, makes organization effectively synonymous, or organizing effectively synonymous with hetero organization, i.e. organization imposed by another, organization imposed from outside. Which means that the possibility of distinguishing organization from self-organization then hinges on the possibility of drawing a boundary separating inside, so in this case, what a circumscribed collection of people spontaneously think and want, and outside, the external influence of those who do not belong to that group. To that, one adds an implicit value judgment that whatever comes from within the boundary is preferable to whatever comes from without. This is the usual, these are the assumptions, the coordinates of this grammar that I'm discussing. And the irony is, of course, that the impossibility of drawing such boundaries in absolute terms was precisely what led early thinkers of self-organization to warn that, in a certain sense, self-organizing systems did not exist at all. I'm sure all of you will be familiar with what is definitely, hands down, my favorite way of opening an academic conference ever. Heinz von Förster's talk at the opening of the Interdisciplinary Symposium on Self-Organizing Systems in 1959 in Chicago, that starts with the statement, self-organizing systems do not exist, i.e. the subject of this academic conference does not exist. At a follow-up event, the same follow-up of the same event a few years later, Ross Ashby would also conclude that since, I quote, no system can correctly be said to be self-organizing, and since use of the phrase self-organizing tends to perpetuate a fundamentally confused and inconsistent way of looking at the subject, the phrase is probably better allowed to die out. again, a great thing to say at a conference on self-organizing systems. So obviously, in both cases, for Heinz von Förster and from Ashby, the issue is the same. If a self-organizing system is one that is capable of changing its internal state according to information and using energy received from the environment, it cannot be considered a closed or isolated system, and is, in a very important sense, a subsystem of a larger, or in fact of several increasingly larger system, of a larger system or several increasingly larger systems to which it belongs, from which a number of consequences follow. The first being that the boundaries between systems, either vertical, between different scales or levels of integration of systems, or horizontals between systems existing at the same scale, depend on the observer. Which means, for the purposes of our discussion here, that the same thing may be seen as hetero or self-organization, depending on how one draws the boundary. The second consequence being that the inside-outside distinction is far from self-evident. We choose how we demarcate it depending on the point that we want to make. And since outside normally has a negative connotation, the act of drawing itself normally already supposes a value judgment. So one does not judge negatively because a distinction exists. One draws a distinction because one values negatively. Which does not mean, finally, that there are not relations that are more that can be described as more hetero-organized than others, but that distinction depends not on a boundary or on any boundaries existing in any absolute senses, but on the degree of reciprocity in power relations between the different systems that we can draw in that situation, or that we can distinguish within that situation, and degrees of reciprocity in power relations are not boundaries as such, but are a gradient. So there is, again, no absolute way of drawing that distinction, although one can compare power relations in terms of more or less reciprocity. But the more important consequence has to do with the very nature of the opposition between organization and self-organization as being ultimately a matter of the scale of observation. If systems are contained within systems, and the only truly self-organized system would be the universe in its entirety, which is a consequence that Ashby and Heinz von Förster didn't draw, but Spinoza did long before them. So, if an organism is part of a population that is part of an ecosystem, but an organism is at the same time a niche for bacteria that exist at a lower scale, if systems are contained within systems, then isolating a system depends on a choice regarding the scale of phenomena under examination. And according to such a choice, something that can be described as self-organizing on one level, on the level of a system, can also be shown to be hetero-organized at the level of the elements, i.e. of the action of the elements on one another. While also composed of parts that organize one another at lower levels, so on and so forth. So basically, what follows from that is organization and self-organization designate the same process as seen from different perspectives. It's one thing if you look at it from the outside, like a scientist examining the brain, and another if you see it from the inside, as a neuron would. And this is something, again, to find these strange connections between cybernetics and the tradition of debates on political organization. This is something that I think we find implied in a famous passage from the prison notebooks by Gramsci, when Gramsci writes that pure spontaneity does not exist in history, as it would be the same thing as pure mechanicity. So what he's saying there is, entirely spontaneous action would be if people responded as automata to an event, say, a change in social conditions suddenly caused everyone to revolt at once. If this were pure spontaneity, then it would be no different from the behavior of automata, just responding automatically to a change in their environment. Actually, this is not how political action happens, because there is always a process of organizing that revolt. So what people usually have in mind when they talk about spontaneity effectively names a gap in their knowledge that arises from the fact that they are unable to reconstruct that process, to reconstruct the diffusion of a collective behavior across a group. And it is our ignorance of the actual process of how that response was organized through whatever way, which does not have to rely on or depend on any kind of formal organization. Could be the first person to throw a rock at the police, the first person to down tools and fold their arms, the first person to say, we need to have a meeting. It is our ignorance of how that process of diffusion happens that generates the mirage of spontaneity as an instantaneous transformation, like a crowd in a musical suddenly breaking into song. This in turn contributes to perpetuating this grammar that opposes organization to spontaneity, organization to self-organization, in ways that, by feeding into the mistrust of initiative, undermine the very condition for anything happening at all. And this, finally, and I'll conclude with that, is what takes us back to what I described above as a marriage or a higher unity of Leninism and second order cybernetics. Because it means that for finite beings like ourselves who exist within processes that we described as self-organized, self-organization is not something that we could survey from start to finish as if from above and treat it as separate from what we and other finite beings do. Self-organization is also what we organize, is what we do, is the emergent outcome of the things we do. And when we talk about organizing things, we are talking about the very same reality that can be otherwise described as self-organized. The only difference is that we are describing it from a first-person perspective. I hope this wasn't too jumbled. I was trying to compress a lot of stuff, and there would have been a lot more to talk about in relation to the opposition between self-organization and self-management, to the role of chance, to modeling, a lot of other things in which I could have connected debates on political organization and the work that I've tried to do in neither vertical nor horizontal to cybernetics. But hopefully this will be enough for us to start a conversation. And if not, hopefully it will have confused you enough that you will now want to read the book to try and work out what on earth I was just talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. Um, Well, I welcome everyone to start using the chat if you wish, and I will start with a few questions for Rodrigo, and bring you all in as you would like. Um, so, Rodrigo, one of the things that I really appreciate about your book is this what I think of as a transdisciplinary stance or perspective, where you come with a question about understanding political organization and then willing to look, in many different fields for ways of understanding political organization and bringing them together to bear on your question or your inquiry. Yeah, I think that's really wonderful. And so one of the things that intrigues me is that, given how you framed it, your inquiry, you come up with a range of core concepts that overlap with the concepts we use in cybernetics, but also some differences. And so I'm intrigued both by the overlaps, and you pointed out, organization and self-organization, and also in some of the distinctions and some of the types of terms that seem to me to be core to what you've been writing about here. And so there are several that I might mention here. One perhaps that I'll just start with is the idea of fitness. You mentioned, fitness plays a role in your book towards the end there, and I'll just post a quote from the book in the chat with regard to. Um, well, let me just leave it at that. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of fitness and how the kind of role this plays in your thinking?
I'm curious. The way you introduced the question, it sounded like you were trying to point uh, at a difference between the way I seem to be using the concept and the way it is used in cybernetics. So could you expand on, or could you give me some
Yeah,
sense of where
yeah.
you where you were hinting at with that before?
Yeah. Okay. So I've got okay. So for example, um, just to elaborate on what I was saying. So I noticed you've got a set of core concepts. And when I look at some of the, canonical cybernetic lexicons, and I just posted three in the chat there, um, I I see concepts that these folks emphasize that you do not emphasize, and I see concepts that you emphasize that these lexicons do not emphasize. And so so one of the ones that is quite prominent in these types of lexicons is structure. So a complement to organization is structure, and that's common in the writings of Maturana and Varela, for example. Um, and then there are words such as fitness or spontaneity, which you discussed, which are not found in these lexicons. So not that cybernetics folks would necessarily think about it differently. There just may be different nuances in the shades of language.
Yeah, I mean that has to do with the I think ultimately the explanation for that comes down to the to how this project came about. Um, so this is a project that I was actually working on. People often think this book is my is the outcome of my doctoral thesis, but actually it wasn't. I was working on something else entirely and a lot more. I was working on the relationship between the concept of immanence and philosophy, or what the concept of immanence meant for the possibility of philosophy, which is, a very um, intra and meta philosophical problem that had um, probably didn't have much practical application. But in parallel to that, I was also working on this question of political organization, motivated above all, but motivated by, things that I read and I was interested in, but above all, motivated by my actual practical experiences as an activist in particularly from the early 2000s until the cycle of protests of the last decade that I mentioned earlier, the Arab Spring, Occupy, etc. So in that period, precisely when the debates on horizontality, etc., were very present, I was I was thinking about these things, that these questions were coming to me um, because of very practical, um, very practical problems that would come up in political practice. And I guess what happened was I was just throwing everything I had in my repertoire at these problems, trying to, looking for different things that would help me um, think through those problems. And when it came to writing this book, I always described the way I wrote this book as consisting of moving uh, downstream to upstream and back, in the sense that I would often have a sense of these are the practical problems that I'm addressing. And then I would move upstream to try and find, okay, what's the conceptual source of these problems? And what would happen if we changed the concepts here, or if we clarified the concepts, or if we changed the grammar of the concepts? Would these problems continue to exist? Would they maybe be dissolved? Would they appear in a different light, etc.? So this was the movement that I was making, um, rather than building, rather than seriously trying to build a theory from scratch. I was, even though the subtitle of the book is A Theory of Political Organization, I think the choice of article there, actually, uh, a theory, speaks to a certain modesty in the goal, which wasn't. I'm not really trying to close the subject here and come up. Maybe this is something I'll try to do at a later point. Maybe this is something I'll be equipped to do at some point. But I wasn't trying to close the subject. I was trying to build a conceptually sound language that would address all these. I was letting these practical problems guide me in okay, what is a theory that's going to be useful to activists today, that will help them, will prevent them from running into the same dead ends again and again. I'm one of the ways in which I describe my purpose of with the book was that I wanted it to be a book that helped people make new mistakes, um, rather than making the same mistakes over and over again as if they hadn't happened before. Um, and I guess this explains why I'm drawing from a number of different things rather than starting from, I could have started from my philosophical background initially was in post-structuralism and Spinoza. So I could have written a Spinozan book. I could have written a post-structuralist book. Um, but yeah, I wasn't starting really from um, any theoretical parti pris, but I was starting from practical problems and then within my theoretical repertoire, trying to build a conceptual structure that would allow me to address all those problems and produce a language that I thought would be more productive for people to talk about political organization and even communicate across different political traditions. Like one of my goals was that, you know, this would allow Marxists and anarchists to see the organizational problems that they had as the same problem, even if they were coming at it with different value systems, etc. But I'm still curious as to what the question with the concept of fitness is. Um, why was that one that you flagged in particular?
Why is that one that I'm flat? Well, you in the quote that I posted in the chat there, you introduce the term fitness in relevance to populism. And so, you know, one of the ways that we might talk about cybernetics is in terms of models. So I'll post a little more in the chat here. So I mean, there are many citations that I might point to here. So one from Anthony Wilden here: cybernetics is explicitly a science of models, and then from Bernard Scott, in his recent book about models as well. And so it's intriguing to me when you take an abstract concept like populism, and it seems to me you're providing some type of grounding for it by your by discussing it in terms of fitness, which I can understand more clearly, even though you haven't provided, even though there's no visual presentation as Bernard Scott is pointing to in your book. I start to grasp populism in a way that I hadn't before because of your reference to something that sounds to me like it could be modeled in terms of fitness. And so that was intriguing to me. So I think that's
Hmm.
one impetus for my question there.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, that was precisely the idea in that particular case, because it felt to me that precisely when people, obviously populism was something that came back, you know, after uh, the retreat or defeat of those movements of in the first half of the decade. There was an attempt to to direct some of that energy into electoral politics, with Bernie Sanders in the US, with Podemos in Spain, with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, so on and so forth. And then the question of populism became very present. So from 2014 onwards, 2015, everyone was talking about populism for a while. Um, and I wanted to say precisely by introducing the concept of fitness was, look, we need to separate the discussion on politics, on populism, from the discussion uh, from what a lot of people are actually talking about, which is something that populism is only one solution for. There is a problem. We can model a problem that we can describe as the problem of fitness, um, for which populism is one solution, but it's not the problem. And we need to stop confusing the solution that we're discussing at the moment with the problem, because it may be perfectly possible that we'll find other solutions and that there are actually better solutions for this problem. So yeah, effectively what I was trying to do there, I guess you could say that I was thinking in very cybernetic terms there in the sense that I was trying to build a more general, a more abstract model for the problem that people were discussing, in order to avoid this confusion between what was the problem, what I was defining as the problem of fitness, and then the specific answer through which people had arrived at that problem, had started to. The problem was, in practice, people started formulating the problem because they were discussing one solution for it, and I wanted to separate those two things.
Mhm, mhm. Well, let me invite, there are a couple of questions in the chat. If someone would like to, raise a hand and join this conversation, now would be, I welcome you to join in, or if no one raises a hand, I will continue myself. Giannis, I see you have a physical hand up there.
Yeah, physical hand. I'm here with Kevin Dye. We were both in your conference this year, and you were in our conference in ISSS. I'm the president-elect for next year for the ISSS, and I will be hosting our conference in Cyprus, so you are all very welcome to come and maybe do something along these lines. I didn't have a question, but the presentation was very inspiring because the whole day we were discussing something very similar. We had also some Turkish Cypriots here for lunch, and Americans and Cypriots, and we were discussing, and we had like a discussion about what the Cypriots can do, which is like a self-organizing system. And we were split that the solution to the Cyprus problem, which is a political problem, depends to a great extent to us getting better self-organized. And it's more ethical and it's more correct that those that are inside the system should take responsibility about their system. They have their visions. We work with structured democratic dialogue, and we do a lot of workshops so people can design their future, construct it. However, the problem is not solved because there are outside forces, very powerful outside forces that have interests. And this includes not only Greece and Turkey, as many people think, but it also includes Israel and the USA and Russia. And now the geopolitical situation is unstable, which is a good situation, according to what Rodrigo said, for small things to do something big. And that was the other half of our discussion, because that's one of the two conditions that you said during complexity, in a complex system, that a small change, a small intervention can produce maybe something bigger. And the other was the critical mass. And we were discussing that because something happened these weeks. We have some new ideas on the table that we managed as citizens to wire them all the way to the UN and to the US government. So kind of critical mass. So I saw a lot of relevance with, scientific grounding of what we were doing without thinking about that kind of science. And it was very interesting to put it in that perspective, So just sharing.
Thank you, Giannis. Rodrigo, any follow-up?
I mean, I would sadly, I'm utterly ignorant about Cyprus and the Cypriot situation, I regret to say. Maybe if I attend your conference, then I'll be able to become more knowledgeable about it. But I would just say that like the most definitely the most gratifying moments in the reception of the book have been when people who are I've had discussions with people in renters unions, people in community solidarity kitchens, things like that, and the moments when people who are involved in something very practical say, "Oh, this concept was helped us understand something that we kept running up against that we didn't have a name for, and suddenly there was a name for it, and there was a description of how that thing worked. There was a model for it. When people tell me that, that's usually the most gratifying comments and the most gratifying reception that the book can have.
We can send you a couple of publications if you want to have a quick look to understand what is going on in Cyprus. But Cyprus is separated between Turkish and Greek Cypriot people for 40 years, and they tried to reunite. But the two things that you said were very relevant. One is the boundaries between what you could call a self-organizing system and its surrounding. And these boundaries are moving depending on the situation and the player. And the second that is interesting for us, I don't know if you are aware of structured democratic dialogue. That's a methodology that empowers groups of people to design their future, to discuss collectively and generate a shared language to describe their problem, and then design together and develop together actions in order to create a better future for themselves. So in a sense, if you look at their system as a self-organizing system, then they can themselves, inside the system, do a lot, but not enough, because there are things that they cannot do simply because they are not an isolated system. There is something bigger. For example, villagers in a village, they can discuss a lot about their village, but they cannot change everything because they live in a country. That village is in a country, and that country has government. It has also people who don't live in the village but have interest in the village. So the boundaries of that system it makes it impossible to talk about a well-defined system that you could call self-organizing. So all this discussion that you made about that was very enlightening to us.
Thank you, Yannis. And I'll post in the chat here. Yannis is speaking as the incoming president of the ISSS about the conference that will happen in summer of 2026. Eric, I see you have a hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, can you understand me all right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Hi, thanks Rodrigo for the talk. And I wanted to ask you if you know of like any engagement with your work in the context and with like representatives of this new like and the renewed discourse on democratic economic planning. And like because I mean I feel like there's like so much overlap there, but I have never really encountered yet someone who like took up your book and tried like, okay, hey, what can we learn from that book? Maybe like in methodological ways, how we can think about these questions that we come up against when we think about planning. And yeah, I think that would be really fruitful. And I just want to ask if you have like, or maybe like some of your own thoughts, if there is something in your head on this. Yeah.
Well, first of all, great to see you again, Eric. You actually look younger than the last time I saw you, which was like 3 or 4 years ago.
My life has
Congratulations.
bettered. I'm in less stress now.
Fantastic. I'm glad to hear. Um, so the answer is no, I'm not aware of anything, but this is actually something I've been thinking of working on. I had coming um, after the book came out. I mean, I've published another book that came out in Portuguese, and that just came out in Spanish. Will come out in English next year, but was something on something else entirely. Was on the far right, etc. And since then, I basically had two major research projects, one on transition and the other one on perspectivism. And I'm in the process of deciding that probably the transition project I was trying to bite more than I could chew, or it would probably take me longer to chew that than there's actually time for any transition. Um, so one way of chopping it down to size would actually marry it with the project on perspectivism around this idea that has already come up a little bit in the conversation of modeling. And one of the ideas when I in the book when I propose think about not only organization but strategy in ecological terms, the basic idea behind that, which again is an idea of clear cybernetic inspiration, is that, well, the more complex a collective modeler is, the more complex the models it's capable of producing. So the idea was to bring perspectivism, in the discussion on perspectivism, into the discussion of modeling, to think about collective modeling. So in that sense, this will actually be some of the this should actually be a direction in which I'll be moving in over the next couple of years. Sadly, I don't think I have anything too coherent to say about it just yet. But hopefully when we meet again in a couple of years' time, you will probably be looking even younger, and I will have something more coherent or more interesting, or at the very least coherent, to say.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say, like, if you if you're searching for like dialogue partners or just like to bounce off some ideas, like I'm gonna post a link in the chat again. I recently co-founded the International Network for Democratic Economic Planning. Hit us up on our mail, or like also going out to everybody here. So yeah, we now have like an address where people can come together and discuss these questions, and they're not so isolated anymore. And yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Well, we have just a little bit of time left and a couple of hands up. Jerry and then Jeff. Jerry, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Rodrigo, I've really enjoyed and appreciated the clear explanations or explications you presented to us. And it really is a remarkable synthesis you've achieved when I approach it from a molecular biological perspective. The surprising part to me was the focus on grammar. I mean, the physical parts of scaling and dynamics is pretty obvious for the science. A well-informed cybernetician would be but grammar. And here I've raised this question because of the profound distinctions between the grammar of the molecular biological sciences and ordinary vernacular grammar or symbolic grammar that is used. In what sense are you talking of grammar here, in terms of the distinction between a copula and a predicate, or just between the grammar, say, of English and Russian?
The way in which I'm using the word here is derivative without probably being derivating in too rigorous a way from the way in which Wittgenstein employs the word grammar. When he talks about his philosophy as being therapeutic in the sense that its goal would be to identify confusions that arise from problems in the conceptual grammar that we employ, and that therefore, if you can make that grammar explicit and identify the sources of these problems, you would be able to make those problems, those conceptual problems, or those moments of confusion, those moments when language goes on holiday, as Wittgenstein says. sorry, I forgot how this sentence, speaking of grammar, I forgot how this sentence began, so I have no idea how it should end. But anyway, this was what I had in mind. This was the meaning of grammar that I had in mind when I um, when when I was when I talked about it, because in the back of my mind was this Wittgensteinian idea of the that in the specific case at hand meant actually there's a number of serious practical problems that arise from the fact from the way in which we articulate those conceptual pairs of organization and spontaneity and organization and self-organization. I mean, the case of organization and self-organization is the most interesting because self, the prefix self, there functions as which should function as a qualifier, uh, is actually assumed by this grammar to function as a negation. Self-organized would be in some way the opposite of organized if we take organized to be hetero-organized, as I was calling it. So my initial intuition was there is a number of problems that arise simply from the everyday implicit the everyday the assumptions that are implicit in our everyday usage of these words. And if we make those assumptions explicit, we can make those conceptual problems disappear. So I was using grammar essentially because I had this Wittgensteinian idea of conceptual grammar and language therapy in mind.
So if I understand you correctly, then the heteroorganization effectively depends on a copula and not a predicate.
In what sense?
In the sense of a copula coupling the collective together.
I'm not sure I
Independent
follow.
scale. I mean, that's a non-scalar notion.
I'm not sure I follow you here.
It,
in-
it comes from symbolic logic and the role of
Right.
predicate logic in forming sentences and how a sentence is formed. A copula may well have a subject-subject relationship in the
Mhm.
verb,
So is
whereas
this, are you
predicate
describing,
is
are
the
you by that,
subject-object relation.
by that, are you describing the grammar that I was describing or that I was criticizing or
I'm just
what?
trying to understand how you were using the word
Right,
grammar.
right. Right. Um, I mean, I hadn't thought of it in relation to be quite honest. I hadn't stopped to think of it in relation to the more strict meaning of grammar in 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 symbolic logic uh or in language as such. I was just assuming this um this meaning that the word receives in the work of Wittgenstein. That'll be one. That'll be one for me to think more about, I guess. I don't know if right now. I don't know if there is if there is more to it, but maybe there is. But I'm not sure. I know what is there. Um, All right, I'm not
Thank,
sure I can say what is there without thinking more about it.
Thank you.
thanks,
Thank,
Jerry.
thank you, thank you for what turned out to be a very difficult question.
Jeff, do you want to
Yeah,
unmute?
thank you. Thank you very much. I was really struck by what you started talking about near the end with spontaneity, and just kind of introducing kind of the vector of time a little bit. Um, and I'm thinking specifically, let's say, of the Occupy movement, that, maybe perhaps with a little bit more time, there could have been something more that came out of it. But instead of having time, there was almost this automaton, as you mentioned, like response from corporate media, from sort of the neoliberal state to try to define it from the outside, instead of let that thing happen organically. So I'm wondering, kind of between your experience with activists and political movements in the past, if maybe you could talk a little bit more about just time in general and how spontaneity works in these political movements and spaces.
Did everyone struggle a little bit to hear Jeff's question? Right. So it
Yeah.
wasn't
Sorry.
just me because I think maybe it's because of your headphone.
It's choppy.
Yeah, the sound was
Sorry about that.
choppy. But I understood. I think I understood your question about being about the
His focus was on the spontaneity. And if you could, his
Put that
focus
in the
was on
chat again.
spontaneity, and if you could
right.
expand on that in relation to your work, Jeff, I think that might help.
It's also in the chat now.
Right, great. Um, um, yes. I mean, this is so one of the sentences in the book that I expected was going to be more polemical than it turned out to be, and maybe it wasn't that polemical because no one understood it, because it is a bit tangled. Is that maybe one day we would recognize 2011 as being the 1989 of 1968, in the sense that in the same way that 1989 felt like the definitive end of the dream, the possibility of making good of what started in 1917. Maybe the experience of things like Occupy and the Indignados showed that there were limits in a kind of politics that people associated with 1968, which is to a good extent is actually a retrospective projection on 1968. But maybe one day 2011 would be the moment that we would look at 2011 as the moment when people looked at that alternative model of politics that emerged to a certain extent in opposition to the model of 1917, of the Soviet bloc, of the Russian Revolution, etc., as showing that there were limits there that were also insurmountable and demanded a rethink. And one of or perhaps the main issue there has precisely to do with time. In at least two senses. A, in the sense that the expectation that many people had that 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 what was happening in the squares, that those general assemblies that were, with a rolling cast of people who would come one day and not the next, and would come for half of it and not the whole time, so on and so forth, that could be the basic cell on which society could be organized could start being from that basic cell, through the replication of those cells, that could become the way in which society would be organized, ran very clearly against two problems, at least two problems that have to do with time. One is, within existing conditions, it's impossible for maybe no one except for graduate students. And even then, graduate students have less and less time. But it would be impossible to organize under existing material conditions. It would be impossible to organize anything apart from maybe a society of graduate students under those conditions, like meetings that have no limit of time, that have no clear demarcation of what is and isn't the agenda or the remit, so on and so forth. So eventually, people would just drop out, and in the end, those spaces would become, as a friend of mine once described them, an activist friend of mine once described them, the tyranny of the obsessed, because only the most obsessed would stick around to participate in what was ultimately an exorbitantly time-consuming way of organizing anything, which is just not viable under existing material conditions. And unfortunately, we still exist under existing material conditions, or at least it would take a lot more than that to change the material, a lot more than those protests to change the material conditions under which people exist. So that would be one limit of that politics, of the politics of horizontality as interpreted in that way. And it's a limit that is connected to time. But the other limit is, of course, the idea that if these things last long enough, and if they start being replicated in other places, then everything will change. And then when those things don't last long enough, when they fall apart, either as a consequence of their own contradictions or as a consequence of external repression, usually both, then people say, well, if only they had been allowed to last long enough, they could have won. And the problem with that is, well, in political struggle, not being allowed to last long enough is a very important part of the struggle. If you don't have any protection against that, then there is a problem with your strategy. If your strategy is, if your strategy depends on being allowed indefinite time to work out, then there's a serious problem with it, because anyone whose interests are incompatible with your strategy will do everything they can to prevent you from having an indefinite amount of time. And if you have no way around that, then you do have a problem.
Jeff, any that get to what you were asking about?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, we're at time here, and so I'd just like to thank you so much, Rodrigo, for joining us, and thanks everyone else for coming, and we will see you again.
Well, thank you again for the invitation. Thank you for the great questions, and hopefully see you again